Hello everyone, welcome back. Tonight's history trip has no kings, no castles, and definitely no shiny swords. Instead, it's about something invisible, something that almost deleted entire cities before Netflix, before hand sanitizer, before most houses even had proper bathrooms. Yeah, that far back. Let me hit you with the story. Philadelphia, 1918. The city throws this huge parade. Marching bands, soldiers fresh from the war, families lining the streets, kids waving little flags. It looked like the safest family outing ever. 3 days later, hospitals are overflowing, coffins are sold out, and newspapers basically turn into giant obituary columns. And here's the insane part. It wasn't a bomb, it wasn't enemy fire, it was the flu. In just 6 weeks, that second wave killed more people than 4 years of World War I. 6 weeks. That's like finishing one Netflix season and realising, oh, half your neighbourhood's gone. But here's the thing, this nightmare didn't even start scary. The first wave, back in spring 1918, looked almost ordinary. Soldiers at Camp Funston, Kansas, started coming down sick. Fever, headaches, sore throats, stuff you'd chalk up to just another flu. Commanders literally told them to toughen up and keep moving. Walk it off, soldier, you'll be fine. Now imagine those same coughing guys crammed onto troop trains and ships, thousands of them packed elbow to elbow, sneezing into each other's helmets and sharing food. Within weeks, this so-called ordinary flu had hopped continents. Europe got it, Africa got it, Asia too. The virus wasn't just travelling, it was flying standby on every single troop movement of World War I. Wait, hold it. If you're still here, headphones on, underwear secured, dignity optional. Congratulations, you're now trapped in history, our way. Hit like and subscribe. We drop this kind of chaos twice a week. Alright, one officer later joked that the flu was the only soldier who never needed a uniform, but still made it onto every battlefield. And he wasn't wrong. The thing spread faster than telegrams, and those were already instant compared to snail mail. By the time generals noticed entire units dropping like dominoes, the virus was already unpacking its bags in 3 continents. Doctors at the time didn't panic. They wrote reports that basically said, yes, there's influenza. It's a bit annoying. Nobody expected what was coming. To them, this was background noise. Soldiers always got sick. What's a little fever compared to machine guns? So, the war rolled on. Factories churned, troops kept shipping out, and cities stayed wide open. That's the dangerous part of the first wave. It trained everyone to underestimate it. By the summer of 1918, the flu looked like it had cooled off. Case numbers dropped, deaths slowed down. People thought, see, it's fine, just another seasonal bug. The newspapers barely gave it space. And honestly, who had time to worry about the sniffles when the world was on fire with a global war? Imagine if your smoke alarm went off, but only made this tiny little beep. You'd probably ignore it, right? That's exactly what happened. The first wave was that weak beep, and everyone ignored it until the second wave came in like the full house fire. At Camp Funston, estimates say over 1,000 soldiers got sick in a matter of days. Some units lost so many men to the infirmary that training schedules collapsed. But the deaths were still low, so generals brushed it off. Men recovered, went back to drills, and boarded ships. Except every time they coughed in those tight bunks, the flu won the lottery. By April, outbreaks popped up in France, then Spain, then North Africa. Newspapers in Spain actually covered it more openly, because unlike France or Britain, they weren't censoring war news. That's why it picked up the name Spanish flu. Spoiler, it didn't start in Spain. Spain was just the unlucky country that admitted it existed. It's like being the one kid in class who reminds the teacher about the homework. Spain coughed honestly, so the world went, ah yes, Spanish flu. Meanwhile, the virus was already everywhere, and the rest of Europe was quietly hoping nobody noticed. And that's the setup. A flu that seemed mild, ignored by doctors, censored by governments, and spread by millions of soldiers packed like sardines. By the time the summer lull made people relax, the virus was just catching its breath. Because when it returned in the autumn, it didn't just knock, it kicked the door down. The second wave was about to show the world what a real pandemic looked like. By autumn 1918, the flu came back, like it forgot to RSVP the first time. Except this return visit wasn't mild. This was the boss level. People woke up fine, went to work, and by the evening, their lungs were giving out. Doctors wrote about patients literally drowning in their own fluids. Imagine thinking you just had a regular cold, then realizing your body signed you up for the scariest 24-hour challenge in history. Cities were blindsided. Hospitals filled in days, not weeks. Nurses were told to work shifts so long they basically lived at the hospital. Coffin makers couldn't keep up. And really, that's not the industry where you ever want to hear the phrase overtime. In Philadelphia, the same city that just threw that massive parade, things spiraled fast. First the parade, then 3 days later, hospitals said, no more beds. And by the end of the week, they were digging trenches for mass graves. Picture the city council on Monday, saying, great job everyone, what a parade. And by Friday, they're ordering bulldozers. Talk about a scheduling nightmare. The death rate was staggering. In just 6 weeks, the flu killed more people than 4 years of trench warfare. Generals were still drawing arrows on maps, planning campaigns, and meanwhile, the virus speed ran the whole scoreboard like, nice war you got there. Shame if someone outpaced it before Halloween everyday life turned into theatre of the absurd. Families ran out of black clothes for funerals. Undertakers doubled their prices because they couldn't meet demand. Newspapers had obituary pages so crowded they started combining people. One guy actually complained, please don't list Aunt Mary under the same heading as the shoemaker. She hated that man. Even at the peak of a pandemic, humans found time for petty rivalries. City officials scrambled to slow things down. Some tried banning gatherings, others closed schools, theatres, churches. Denver reopened too early, cases exploded, and they had to slam shut again. Boston tried military hospitals, but those filled instantly. Philadelphia, oh Philadelphia, decided to go big with a war bond parade. 200,000 people, shoulder to shoulder, just as flu cases were ticking up. Within 3 days, thousands were sick. Within a week, bodies were piling so fast the city literally begged Washington for help burying them. Imagine being the poor guy whose job was announcing the daily numbers at those council meetings. Day 1, the count doubled. Day 2, it doubled again. By day 5, you just start with, look, it's bad. Stop asking me for a silver lining. The second wave didn't just hit hard, it hit weird. Normally flu kills the very old and the very young. In 1918, the 20 to 40-year-olds, the strong, the workers, the soldiers, were the ones filling coffins. Entire regiments were taken out not by bullets but by coughs. Families lost breadwinners in days. If you were young and healthy, congratulations, you were in the riskiest demographic on earth. Being strong was the worst insurance plan of the year. Doctors had no clue why. Some blamed mustard gas from the war. Others guessed the virus was brand new, and no one had immunity. The modern theory is what we call a cytokine storm. Your immune system, instead of calmly fighting back, panicked like a teenager in a group chat. One tiny message, boom, 300 replies, arguments, people leaving, people rejoining. Except instead of drama, it was your lungs filling with your own defense system. Effective? Not really. The reports are haunting. Nurses described wards where patients turned blue from lack of oxygen. Whole rooms full of young men, blue lips, blue faces, gasping for air. It didn't look like a Smurf cartoon. It looked like the colour blue had become a warning sign. One doctor wrote that some patients died so quickly, families couldn't even summon a priest before it was over. And here's the kicker, we still don't fully know why. 100 years later, with genome sequencing and labs that can map a virus in days, historians and scientists are still debating the exact mechanics. Was it the war? The virus? Some unlucky immune trick? The mystery isn't totally solved. All we know is if you were 25 in 1918, you were suddenly less safe than your grandfather, and the scale kept climbing. Globally, cities shut down in panic. Churches locked their doors. Theatres went dark. Handshakes were banned in some places. Entire neighbourhoods vanished, not because of bombs, but because neighbours couldn't stop coughing on each other. Imagine your social calendar shrinking from weddings, dances and theatre nights to staying home and praying your roommate doesn't sneeze. The second wave also revealed just how uneven responses could be. St. Louis shut things down quickly and cut their death rate in half compared to Philadelphia. It was the first real curve-flattening lesson, except nobody called it that yet. Historians now use those two cities as the textbook example. Act early and you save thousands. Hesitate and you dig trenches. And people noticed. Letters poured in. One nurse in New York wrote, "We haven't had sleep in 3 days. If we lie down, there's another knock at the door." Students in medical school were pulled out of class to serve as frontline doctors. Teachers became volunteer nurses. Everyone was drafted, not into the army, but into the war against a virus. Yet even in the chaos, there were these flashes of humanity. Neighbours cooking for sick families, churches ringing bells when someone finally recovered. Kids delivering food baskets to houses marked with quarantine signs. And yes, the occasional person still sneaking to bars because apparently even a global pandemic can't stop bad decisions. The first wave trained the world to shrug. The second wave trained the world to panic. And the scars left behind, rows of graves, empty homes, broken economies, were deeper than most wars could manage. Here's where the Spanish flu flipped the script. Normally, flu kills the very young and the very old. In 1918, the 20 to 40-year-olds, the group you'd bet money on to survive, were suddenly the ones in the most danger. Imagine being told, "Congratulations, you're young and healthy, that's the problem." Doctors were baffled, families were terrified, communities were watching their strongest members collapse, while children and grandparents sometimes made it through. It was like life insurance worked in reverse. People even joked bitterly, "The safest thing you can be right now is a toddler." Not exactly the pep talk you want in the middle of a pandemic. Modern scientists think the answer was what we call a cytokine storm. Instead of calmly fighting off the virus, young immune systems went full drama mode. Think of it like your body's security team spotting a pickpocket and responding by blowing up the whole mall. Overkill much? That explains why soldiers, factory workers and young parents were among the hardest hit. One doctor wrote that his hospital was full of strong men laid low in 24 hours. And the weird part, some of the elderly seemed to be more resistant. The leading theory is they'd been exposed to a milder flu decades earlier, so their bodies had a bit of leftover immunity. Basically, Grandma had old antivirus software installed, and somehow it still worked. Meanwhile, the strongest demographic, those in their prime, were the ones disappearing. It broke entire households. Breadwinners gone, communities losing teachers, police officers, shopkeepers, whole neighbourhoods went quiet. And here's where the social dynamics got even stranger. With young adults dying, kids were often raised by grandparents, while families scrambled to figure out who was even left to take care of them. Doctors kept detailed notes because they couldn't believe what they were seeing. One physician described young patients who went from healthy to helpless in hours. Another wrote about wards full of men turning blue from lack of oxygen, even as their parents, decades older, sat in the same room and recovered. It didn't match any medical logic they knew, and that mystery still haunts scientists today. Even with modern labs, we don't fully know why the age curve flipped. Was it the virus's genetics? Was it the immune overreaction? Or was it just an unlucky combination of timing, war, and bodies caught in the middle? The statistics were brutal. In some towns, the majority of graves from 1918 are marked with the ages 20 to 40. It looked like an entire generation was targeted, and people at the time noticed. One newspaper headline literally read, "The flower of youth is gone." But if you looked closely, kids playing in the street and grandparents in rocking chairs were sometimes the ones who survived. It's worth pointing out how bizarre this must have felt. Imagine being a 25-year-old, hearing that grandma is statistically safer than you. Suddenly family dinners must have been awkward. Eat your soup, dear. Why, so I can die faster than you? And this wasn't just about numbers. The social structure took a direct hit. Armies lost soldiers, factories lost workers, entire villages lost a generation that kept the economy going. Survivors wrote that it felt like the middle of society had been hollowed out. And yet, life kept stumbling forward. Grandparents raising grandkids, children watching parents vanish overnight. Whole communities forced to rebuild with whoever was left standing. Even a century later, historians say this is what makes the Spanish flu stand apart. Not just the scale of deaths, but the sheer weirdness of who lived and who didn't. The young and healthy, the exact group that should have had the advantage, were the ones most at risk. And that strange pattern is still one of medicine's unsolved puzzles. By the end of 1918, the Spanish flu wasn't background noise anymore. It was the headline, the thing you couldn't escape. Cities that had laughed it off during the first wave were suddenly drawing up laws like their lives depended on it. San Francisco even passed something called the mask law. And this wasn't a polite, please cover your face. This was, step outside without one, and it'll cost you $5. Adjust that for inflation, and you're basically paying the price of a decent dinner today just to sneeze in public. The rules changed overnight. Schools closed, churches locked up, movie theatres, dance halls, even pool halls went dark. It was like society hit pause, only no one agreed on when they could hit play again. Families had to delay weddings, funerals were cut short, and birthdays were celebrated in whispers. People compared it to a snowstorm, shutting everything down, but this storm didn't melt in a few days. Officials scrambled to enforce the new order. Police and volunteers walked the streets, making sure masks stayed on. If you didn't comply, you could be fined, sometimes even arrested. One San Francisco man made the mistake of arguing that masks made him look ridiculous. The judge didn't see the humour and slapped him with a penalty. Somewhere, someone probably muttered, "Better to look silly than be buried early." Masks themselves became a sort of fashion statement, if by fashion you mean piles of gauze wrapped around your head. Housewives stitched them at home, some adding lace to make them look less grim. Others punched holes so they could slip a cigarette through, which worked about as well as poking a hole in a submarine. You could walk down Market Street and spot men puffing away, smoke leaking from their masks like broken chimneys. It was theatre, but not the kind you bought tickets for. Public life reshaped itself in strange ways. Pastors dragged pews outside to hold open-air services. Choirs sang to half-empty lots, their voices blown around by the wind. In Chicago, a theatre tried spacing seats 6 feet apart and bragged in the newspaper that their shows were cleaner than your own living room. The truth? Germs don't respect reserved seating. Audiences still stayed away. Bars and restaurants were hit especially hard. Owners swore they disinfected every table, every spoon, every doorknob. Some even printed signs that read, "Our establishment is germ-free," as if germs read the fine print. But business dried up anyway. Regulars grumbled that they'd risked worse things in the trenches, but most people stayed home. Empty stools and silent jukeboxes became the new soundtrack. Not everyone accepted the restrictions. In January 1919, San Francisco saw the rise of the Anti-Mask League. Thousands of citizens packed an auditorium, ironically breaking every rule they were protesting, to demand the law be overturned. They shouted that masks were useless, uncomfortable, an attack on personal freedom. It sounded familiar to anyone alive in the 2020s. The funniest part? At least one attendee got the flu from that very meeting. History has a dark sense of humour, even if the people living it didn't. Even smaller rules piled up. Cities banned spitting, and officers actually handed out tickets for it. Posters warned that sneezing in public could be treated like a crime. Imagine suffering from hay fever and suddenly being public enemy number one. Handshakes disappeared overnight, replaced with stiff nods. One paper joked that the elbow bump might make a comeback, though mostly people just avoided touching altogether. Daily routines collapsed. Teachers were sent home when schools closed, only to be reassigned as emergency nurses. College students were drafted into makeshift hospitals, barely trained, suddenly responsible for treating patients. Parents struggled with kids at home full-time, inventing games to keep them busy, while worrying about neighbours falling sick. Even grocery shopping felt dangerous. Store owners begged customers to line up outside, 6 feet apart, while clerks darted in and out with bags. The psychological toll showed. Letters from the time are filled with phrases like, "tired of the mask," or "longing for the day I can sit in church again." Some families tried to find humour in it. Kids cut eye holes in their masks and pretended to be bandits. One father wrote that his children robbed the cookie jar every afternoon under the guise of public safety. It was a small rebellion in a year full of bigger ones. Meanwhile, city leaders tried to keep morale up with posters, promising the rules wouldn't last forever. The problem? Nobody could say when it would end. Each extension felt like moving the goalposts further away. In San Francisco, when the mask law was finally lifted, crowds tore off their masks and cheered in the streets like the war had ended. But the flu wasn't done yet. Cases surged again, within weeks, proving germs don't care about parades or optimism. Looking back, the mask and closure era revealed just how fragile daily life really was. 1 month you were planning a wedding, the next you were sewing masks at the kitchen table. 1 week you were buying tickets for the theatre, the next you were told theatres could kill you. People adapted because what else could they do? They tied cloth around their faces, kept their distance, and waited for the invisible storm to pass. And while many complained, protested, or broke the rules, the majority did what humans always do in a crisis. They grumbled, adjusted, and hoped tomorrow would be easier. Even with rules, closures, and mask patrols, not everyone bought into the idea that flu was the real enemy. Panic and rumours filled the gaps where science struggled. In California, the anti-mask league grew louder, holding rallies and packing auditoriums with people eager to prove a point, that wearing a gauze mask was somehow worse than catching the flu itself. Of course, cramming into a hall with no masks worked about as well as holding a fire safety meeting while juggling torches. Within days, some attendees fell sick, which answered the debate better than any politician could. Rumours took on a life of their own. In the middle of World War I, some swore the flu wasn't natural at all, but a German weapon smuggled in with U-boat spies. Pamphlets circulated claiming the Kaiser had invented a death cloud and released it in American cities. Never mind that the first wave started in Kansas. When panic sets in, geography takes a back seat. People were ready to believe anything that explained why their healthy neighbours were suddenly collapsing. Bars and markets became rumour factories. Shopkeepers whispered that onions hung in the house could stop infection. Families filled bowls with camphor or garlic. Convinced strong smells scared the virus away. Others chewed tobacco, claiming it kept the lungs warm. The real result? Bad breath and empty wallets. Pharmacies did brisk business selling tonics with ingredients that ranged from whiskey to turpentine. If it burned on the way down, people figured it must be medicine. And while officials urged distancing, plenty of folks kept flocking to public spaces. In Denver, the city reopened theatres after a drop in cases, only to see infections spike immediately. In Philadelphia, saloons still filled up at night. The logic being, if everyone's already coughing, what's one more round? The mayor begged residents to stay home, but his own council members were caught hosting dinner parties. The message became clear: do as we say, not as we do. The divide between believers and skeptics grew sharper. Some citizens refused to wear masks, arguing that God would decide their fate. Others claimed masks were un-American, comparing them to muzzles. A San Francisco newspaper printed angry letters daily, one saying, "I refuse to be suffocated by gauze for the sake of my neighbour's paranoia." Doctors fired back in editorials, begging people to remember that germs didn't care about patriotism. The numbers told the story better than the arguments. Cities that acted fast and stuck with closures, like St. Louis, cut their death rates in half compared to places that hesitated, like Philadelphia and Denver. One historian later wrote that it was the first accidental trial in public health policy. City versus city. Rules versus freedom. Outcome measured in funerals. Still, resistance was everywhere. Some saloon owners quietly propped open back doors and served drinks after hours. Baseball teams tried to sneak in games without spectators, only to be shut down by police. Church groups argued they had the constitutional right to gather, even if gathering meant spreading disease. Judges had to weigh sermons against science in real time. In some towns, officers even arrested priests for holding mass. Ordinary families felt the tension too. Letters from the time described neighbours glaring at each other in the street, one family masked up, the other defiantly barefaced. In small towns, rumours spread that the unmasked were carrying germs on purpose. It created divisions sharper than politics. Suddenly your social status wasn't about money or class. It was about whether you tied cloth over your nose. Even with fear everywhere, life couldn't stop completely. Food had to be sold, mail had to be delivered, factories had to keep running. Many workers simply showed up sick, coughing into handkerchiefs, too afraid of losing wages. Railroads kept running with skeleton crews, but passengers noticed trains arriving late and dirtier than usual. No one wanted to clean cars if it meant touching infected seats. The strain on communities grew unbearable. Doctors begged for more resources, nurses fainted from exhaustion, and yet protests kept breaking out. People wanted their freedom back, their routines back, their lives back. When San Francisco finally lifted the mask law, citizens ripped off their masks in the streets, tossing them into the air like graduation caps. The celebrations were short-lived. Cases rose again within weeks, proving the flu wasn't done with them yet. Looking back, this mix of panic, rumour and resistance shows a pattern that feels familiar even a century later. People faced with uncertainty grab onto anything: folk remedies, conspiracy theories, or flat-out denial. Rules divide communities. Leaders hesitate. And while some follow orders to the letter, others decide they know better. In 1918, just like today, humanity proved it could be clever, stubborn, gullible, and resilient all at once. By late 1918, hospitals weren't just overwhelmed, they were in total collapse. Beds lined the hallways, cots spilled into lobbies, and when those ran out, gymnasiums and schools turned into makeshift wards. Doctors begged for reinforcements, but there simply weren't enough trained hands. Cities drafted medical students who had barely practiced on cadavers. Suddenly they were treating real patients gasping for air. One wrote in his journal, "I was supposed to be learning the bones of the hand. Instead, I was holding a man's hand as he died." Teachers, priests, even postal workers were pulled in as emergency caregivers. The training was laughably brief. Wash your hands, tie on a mask, and hope you don't faint. And fainting happened a lot. Volunteers described working 2 or 3 days straight with nothing but coffee and bread. If you collapsed, someone shook you awake and shoved you back into the ward. No timeouts, no sympathy. At home, life was just as strange. Schools stayed closed, leaving kids stuck inside. Parents complained that their children had turned into indoor hurricanes. Some tried homeschooling, others just gave up. One mother confessed she attempted to teach math until her son answered every problem with flu. Not correct, but hard to argue with the mood of the year. Neighbourhoods took on new rules. Handshakes, an everyday habit, were suddenly banned. People scrambled for replacements. Hat tips, stiff bows, even tapping shoes. A few tried waving elbows like they were signalling a parade float. Nobody liked it, but nobody wanted a $5 fine either. Spitting, once routine on sidewalks, now carried tickets. Posters shouted, "Don't spit, spread disease," like people needed to be reminded sidewalks weren't public spittoons. Police bragged about catching repeat offenders. One officer claimed he fined the same man 3 times in 1 week. The man argued he had a medical condition. The judge disagreed. Mail delivery turned into a source of paranoia. Carriers left letters on porches instead of knocking. Families sprinkled envelopes with disinfectant before opening, and some went further, actually ironing their mail. Imagine explaining to your cousin why her postcard showed up with scorch marks. Markets and food lines became surreal scenes. Clerks wore masks, customers stood apart, and everyone eyed each other's coughs like jewels. Some families relied on neighbours to drop off meals. Others left food at doorsteps for sick relatives, ringing the bell and running away like it was a strange new holiday tradition. Factories and transport had to keep going no matter what. Streetcar drivers sat behind masks, steering through half-empty cities. Factory owners pinned signs that read, "If you are sick, do not come to work. If you miss work, you will be replaced." Comforting, right? Workers often showed up coughing into handkerchiefs, terrified of losing wages. Railroads ran late because cleaning crews refused to touch infected cars. Passengers wrote letters complaining that trains smelled like sickness. And while hospitals filled, there still weren't enough doctors. Cities pressed medical students into duty, yes, but also priests, teachers, even barbers. Anyone who could hold a basin or wipe a fevered brow got called in. Records show some patients had only a single volunteer watching over dozens of sick beds. People collapsed from exhaustion, yet the line of stretchers never stopped. Families faced emotional costs too. Hospitals banned visitors. So many patients died alone. To cope, some wrote farewell letters, sealed in envelopes labelled, "Open if I die." Postmen later remembered delivering stacks of them in single neighbourhoods. One mailman recalled walking away from a porch with tears because he knew the letter inside was someone's last words. Communities tried to find moments of levity. Kids chalked encouragements on sidewalks. Neighbours left bread or soup at doors. Teachers who weren't drafted as nurses wrote simple lesson sheets for children to complete at home. They became the earliest version of remote learning, except instead of laptops it was messy handwriting and chalkboards dragged into living rooms. Of course, not every adjustment worked. People attempted folk remedies. Onions hung in windows, garlic necklaces and whiskey tonics. Pharmacies sold mixtures with camphor, turpentine, or even kerosene. Yes, kerosene, as if chugging flammable liquid would scare away germs. Doctors begged people to stop poisoning themselves, but desperation overrode logic. Entertainment didn't vanish completely. Some towns tried outdoor concerts, musicians performing in parks while audiences sat scattered like picnic blankets. Kids played baseball in alleys with masks tied under their chins, though adults quickly banned it once coughing fits spread. Families read newspapers obsessively, hunting for good news that rarely came. Despite the exhaustion, people improvised to keep morale alive. In one Minnesota town, neighbours leaned out of windows every evening to sing hymns together, each family separated but still connected. Elsewhere, shopkeepers painted funny slogans on their closed doors. Flu took the week off, or back when the germs behave. It was grim comedy, but better than silence. Daily struggles stretched far beyond medicine. Weddings were postponed indefinitely, funerals shortened to minutes, churches forced outdoors, sports vanished. One child later wrote that his biggest memory of 1918 was asking why adults never smiled anymore. It wasn't that laughter disappeared completely, but the small rituals of normal life, from handshakes to Sunday games, felt like they'd been erased overnight. And yet survival happened in the little improvisations, awkward elbow greetings, scorched mail, mothers teaching math with flu as the universal answer. The pandemic wasn't only fought in wards or government offices, it was fought in kitchens, porches and classrooms, by ordinary people doing the best they could in a world turned upside down. While cities struggled with closures and awkward elbow greetings, the flu had a bigger advantage: World War I. Armies were basically global delivery systems for germs. Troop ships, barracks, and trenches, perfect petri dishes with free worldwide shipping. It started with Camp Funston in Kansas, where soldiers trained before heading to Europe. Thousands caught the flu within days, but since the military couldn't just press pause on a world war, sick men still boarded ships. Imagine trying to keep morale high while half the deck sounded like a tuberculosis choir. The spread was faster than telegrams. One officer described boarding healthy, only to arrive in Europe with dozens dead. On the USS Leviathan, hundreds of soldiers never made it to the battlefield because they died en route. It turned the phrase overseas deployment into something much darker, though the official reports softened it with phrases like unexpected complications. Families knew better. Trenches turned into germ exchanges. Soldiers lived shoulder to shoulder, mud up to their knees, swapping canteens and cigarettes. Flu ripped through faster than any artillery barrage. Letters from the front described rows of men collapsing mid-march, sometimes more from fever than enemy fire. Commanders hated it because you can't order a virus to retreat. And the flu didn't respect borders. By the time it reached France, British, French, and American troops carried it deeper into Europe. Within weeks, cases popped up in Spain, Italy, and beyond. Spain wasn't even fighting in the war, but it ended up lending its name, Spanish flu. Why? Because Spanish newspapers actually reported on it. Censorship in wartime nations meant their papers kept quiet, not wanting to admit their armies were collapsing from coughs. Spain, neutral and honest, got stuck with the blame. Congratulations, honesty. You've just branded a pandemic. Civilians weren't spared either. Ports swarmed with sick passengers. Dock workers unloaded supplies and caught the virus in the process. From there, it spread inland with trains, carrying germs to cities that thought war was their only problem. A Boston newspaper reported that one day 200 sailors disembarked, and by the end of the week, thousands in the city were sick. Not exactly the welcome party anyone wanted. Meanwhile, soldiers brought the flu wherever the war dragged them. British troops spread it to India. French troops carried it into North Africa. From India, it spread to villages where medical care was already stretched thin, leading to catastrophic death tolls. Historians estimate around 12 million died in India alone. That's not battlefield casualties, that's influenza, hitching a ride on empire supply lines. Even rural America wasn't safe. Small towns far from the war suddenly saw trainloads of returning soldiers. Locals lined up to greet their heroes, only to contract a virus deadlier than any bullet. Newspapers begged families not to throw parades for troops coming home, which sounded unpatriotic but turned out to be life-saving advice. If you're picturing the world map lighting up like a video game infection mode, you're not far off. Within months, cases existed on every continent except Antarctica. Ships carried it to South America, to Australia, to Pacific Islands. In Western Samoa, brought by a single ship, the flu killed over 20% of the population in just a few weeks. What amazed observers wasn't just how fast it travelled, it was how unstoppable it seemed. Quarantine slowed it down in some places, but in others it leapt over borders before officials even knew what hit them. One American doctor wrote, "We were trying to fight a fire with teaspoons of water, and the war made everything worse. Hospitals were already short on supplies. Doctors had been drafted, leaving civilian populations with fewer professionals. Governments insisted factories keep churning out weapons, even as workers dropped from illness. Leaders told citizens the flu was just another sickness, so morale wouldn't collapse, but the cemeteries told the real story." Looking back, the Spanish flu didn't just spread because it was contagious. It spread because humanity had built the perfect delivery system. Millions of men packed into ships, trenches and trains, moving across the globe with no concept of social distancing. A germ couldn't have asked for better logistics. In a twisted way, the war made the pandemic invisible at first. People expected soldiers to die from bullets or shells, not from fever and coughs. Commanders downplayed reports, Governments censored the news, and by the time the truth leaked out, the virus was already halfway around the world. So when we say the Spanish flu moved faster than telegrams, it's not an exaggeration. Telegrams reached capitals. The flu reached villages that had never even seen a telegram office. It didn't care about battle lines, treaties, or strategies. Wherever the war went, the virus was already there, one step ahead, no uniform required. Cities got hit like punching bags. Crowded streets, packed apartments, and lines for food meant the flu spread faster than gossip at a family reunion. In Philadelphia, one doctor described walking down a block where almost every door had a black ribbon tied outside. Entire households went silent within a week. Hospitals in big cities were already full, so when the second wave hit, they cracked wide open. Nurses laid patients on floors between beds, in stairwells, even on front porches, with blankets thrown over them. In New York, undertakers ran out of coffins. Families stacked bodies in spare rooms until someone could pick them up. Authorities eventually had to dig mass graves just to keep up. Public transport didn't stop. People still had to get to work, but riding a streetcar turned into a lottery ticket. You sat elbow to elbow with coughing strangers, trying to guess who was contagious. Some commuters held handkerchiefs over their faces. Others wore makeshift masks. A few just muttered prayers and hoped their number wouldn't come up. Meanwhile, rural communities had a very different story. Distance was their best defense. Farms spread out miles apart meant fewer opportunities for germs to travel. Some villages put up literal barricades, refusing entry to outsiders. In one Alaskan settlement, locals stationed armed guards at the edge of town. The rule was simple: no visitors, no exceptions. It worked. Those villages escaped untouched. Other places weren't so lucky. In western Alaska, villages that didn't shut themselves off were devastated. Entire communities lost nearly everyone. Dogs roamed the streets because there weren't enough people left to care for them. A missionary described walking into one village where the only survivors were a handful of children who didn't even know how to bury the dead. Isolation cut both ways. If a rural town managed to block outsiders, it survived. But if even one infected person slipped in, the results were catastrophic. No doctors, no nurses, no supplies, just families trying to nurse each other with home remedies. In some places, so many adults died that neighbours had to round up orphans and house them in makeshift shelters. The numbers tell the split. In dense cities like Philadelphia, Boston and London, death rates skyrocketed, sometimes 3 times higher than rural areas. Meanwhile, isolated farming towns often escaped with few or no cases. Geography was destiny. Crowded blocks meant disaster. Empty fields sometimes meant safety. But rural life wasn't all victory. Supply chains faltered. Farmers still needed to sell grain, milk, and livestock, but buyers didn't always come. In some areas, crops rotted in fields because whole families were too sick to harvest. A few towns begged the government to send soldiers to help gather food, which was about as far from normal farm life as you can imagine. And then there was the social element. City folk mocked rural paranoia until they saw country survival rates. One Kansas farmer reportedly nailed a sign to his gate: "No visitors, no sales, no flu." He survived. Meanwhile, urban households were told to boil handkerchiefs daily and hope for the best. The biggest difference was visibility. In cities, the flu was everywhere. You couldn't walk down a street without seeing hearses, closed businesses, or coughing crowds. In the countryside, if isolation worked, life looked deceptively normal. Cows still needed milking, wheat still needed threshing. From a distance, the farm fields seemed peaceful. Up close, they were just as anxious, families praying their isolation held. Letters from the time capture the divide. A New York clerk wrote that he attended 3 funerals in one day. A farmer in Nebraska wrote, "We hear it is bad in the cities. Here we still rise, milk, and plough. The sickness has not reached us, thank the Lord." Same year, same country, Completely different realities. It's tempting to imagine rural towns smug about their survival, but the truth was less romantic. Many were just lucky. Others made harsh decisions, like refusing to let outsiders in, even if those outsiders were relatives. There are stories of families turned away at town gates, forced to camp in fields because villagers wouldn't risk exposure. Survival came with guilt. And while rural areas dodged some bullets, cities had one strange advantage: resources. Even overwhelmed hospitals had more doctors than most rural counties had total. Cities received government aid faster, more medicine, more supplies. The countryside sometimes waited weeks for shipments, by which time the virus had already taken its toll. So, urban or rural, nobody really escaped. In crowded places, the flu spread like wildfire. In the countryside, it arrived slower, but hit just as hard when it broke through. The pandemic didn't play favourites, it just followed opportunity. Looking back, the contrast shows how fragile human defences really were. Cities had hospitals, but too many patients. Villages had distance, but no backup plan. Both fought the same invisible enemy, just on different battlegrounds. And whether you were stuck on a trolley in Philadelphia or guarding a frozen outpost in Alaska, the question was the same. Who gets through and who doesn't? By late 1918, the flu wasn't just a health crisis. It had bulldozed daily life and the economy. Shops shuttered, schools padlocked, theatres locked up tight. Imagine walking down a main street in any big city. Windows dark, doors chained, handwritten notes taped up with lines like "closed until safe" or just "closed, period." Even barbershops, where gossip was free with every haircut, went silent. Families felt it in their wallets fast. Parents couldn't work because they were sick, or because their kids were suddenly stuck at home. Breadwinners wrote desperate letters asking for help with rent. Landlords complained too, because even healthy tenants couldn't pay. It was an economy of IOUs nobody wanted to collect. Churches and social events didn't just slow down, they evaporated. Weddings shrank into tiny gatherings. Funerals were cut short, with priests told to keep ceremonies under 10 minutes. Some towns banned choirs because singing was considered dangerous. Nothing like turning amazing grace into a health hazard. Sports were crushed too. Baseball, football, boxing, all cancelled or played in half-empty venues. One newspaper joked that fans were safe from the flu because there were no games to attend. College teams tried to keep training, but outbreaks swept dorms, and suddenly practice looked more like sickbay. Theatres and movie houses tried to survive with gimmicks. Owners advertised that they scrubbed every seat with disinfectant, germ-free entertainment guaranteed. Patrons weren't convinced. A few brave ones still showed up, sitting scattered across huge auditoriums like it was the world's most depressing date night. Factories and essential industries didn't have the luxury of closing. Wartime production lines kept humming, even if half the crew was coughing into their sleeves. Bosses posted blunt signs, "Work or be replaced." Sick workers showed up anyway, sneezing on tools, praying no supervisor noticed. Productivity didn't collapse entirely, but it limped. Imagine trying to assemble weapons with one hand and hold a handkerchief with the other. Transportation staggered along too. Streetcars in Boston ran late because so many drivers were sick. Train stations posted schedules and then immediately broke them. Passengers described boarding coaches that smelled like sickness, disinfectant, and panic, all in one. Baggage handlers sometimes refused to touch luggage if it looked like it came from a flu hotspot. For farmers, the pandemic was insult on top of hardship. Crops still needed harvesting, cows still needed milking, but entire families fell ill at once. Grain rotted in fields because there weren't enough hands to bring it in. Some communities begged soldiers to help with harvest, which wasn't exactly in the training manual. One general later wrote, "We can teach a man to fire a rifle faster than a scythe." Meanwhile, newspapers struggled to keep publishing. Reporters were sick, printers collapsed at presses, and editors scrambled to fill columns with whatever copy arrived. Some editions shrank to half their usual size. Obituaries dominated so much space that one Kansas paper joked it was now the Grim Gazette. The joke fell flat, mostly because it was true. Banks, oddly, stayed open. They even flourished in some cases because people pulled out savings in panic. But spending stopped. Who buys a new suit when you can't attend church, parties, or even a funeral? Tailors complained that their mannequins were better dressed than their customers. Children felt the social hit hardest. With schools shut for months, kids missed friends, sports, and normal routines. Some neighbourhoods organised outdoor classrooms, with desks dragged into yards. Parents snapped photos of kids in coats, trying to do arithmetic in the cold. Teachers admitted the lessons were mostly review. Nobody expected real progress while half the class coughed into scarves. Yet amid all the shutdowns, one thing never fully stopped: the mail. Letters carried news of relatives, business deals, even love stories. One soldier quarantined on a base wrote home, "The only thing more contagious than flu is loneliness." Postal workers became unsung heroes, delivering connection even when they worried every envelope was a germ delivery system. Communities improvised to keep spirits alive. Some towns held parades of wagons with musicians spaced apart, playing from flatbeds, while neighbours waved from porches. Families invented indoor games like Spot the Cough, which wasn't actually fun but killed time. Board games like checkers and dominoes spiked in sales, proving boredom is its own kind of epidemic. Businesses that adapted survived. Breweries started selling disinfectant alcohol instead of beer. Clothing shops turned sewing machines to mask production. Even undertakers tried advertising innovations, like reusable coffins with removable liners. Morbid, yes, but practical. Not all changes were temporary. The flu rewired habits. People became obsessed with hygiene, hand washing, boiling laundry, scrubbing doorknobs. Some of those habits stuck, reshaping how the public thought about health. Before 1918, germs were an abstract idea for many. Afterward, they were a daily enemy, the invisible reason to keep your distance. When the flu finally eased, the economy stumbled back to its feet. Bars reopened, schools filled again, theatres lit their marquees, but scars remained. Businesses never recovered, families buried breadwinners, and communities counted neighbours they'd never see again. The Spanish flu ended not with a bang, but with exhaustion. Still, the improvisation, the makeshift classrooms, the disinfected theatres, they left behind a record of resilience. People didn't stop living entirely. They just lived smaller, quieter, stranger. And somehow, through awkward elbow greetings and empty ballparks, they kept society from falling apart completely. By the time the pandemic slowed, the numbers were staggering. Historians estimate between 50 and 100 million people died worldwide, about 5% of the global population at the time. To put that in perspective, that's more than World War I and World War II combined, and it happened in less than 2 years. If wars build monuments, the flu left math problems nobody wanted to solve. The scale hit different regions in different ways. India lost around 12 million people. Entire villages emptied out, leaving fields untended and homes abandoned. In Africa, the flu cut through communities already strained by colonial policies, leaving records so fragmented that exact numbers remain a mystery. In some areas, oral histories are the only evidence. Stories of grandparents lost in a single week, of children raised by neighbours because no family survived. Even industrial nations were rocked. In the United States, life expectancy dropped by a full 12 years in 1918. That's like the entire country collectively aging in reverse, but not in the fun Benjamin Button way. Newspapers filled with obituary pages that stretched longer than war coverage. One editor admitted they stopped writing unique obits because there were too many names to keep up. Cities tallied deaths like scoreboards. Philadelphia, which had allowed that infamous parade, counted nearly 13,000 dead in just 6 weeks. St. Louis, which moved fast with closures, still lost thousands, but cut its rate in half compared to Philadelphia. The grim math showed public health policies mattered, even if people complained about them at the time. And yet, despite the massive toll, record-keeping wasn't perfect. Rural deaths often went unreported, and colonial governments in Asia and Africa undercounted for political reasons. Some historians argue the real total might lean closer to 100 million. That's roughly the population of Mexico today, erased by one virus. For families, the numbers weren't statistics, they were empty chairs at dinner. Letters from the time mention parents burying multiple children in the same week. One father wrote, "We no longer buy coffins one at a time, we order in sets." It wasn't meant to be witty, but the bluntness shows how normalised tragedy had become. Logistics collapsed under the sheer volume. Coffin makers couldn't keep up. Cities resorted to mass graves, dug by soldiers or even prisoners. Photographs show rows of wooden boxes stacked like cargo, except the cargo was people who had been alive days earlier. Undertakers complained about running out of embalming fluid. A few towns resorted to plain cloth wrappings, skipping tradition entirely just to keep up with the demand. The surreal part: despite millions dying, life still went on in odd ways. Weddings happened quietly, new businesses opened cautiously, and politicians still argued about budgets. Humans proved capable of compartmentalizing even in the face of absurd loss. Some newspapers ran obituaries on one page and ads for phonographs on the next. Grief and commerce sat side by side. Globally, the uneven impact puzzled doctors. Why did some regions lose entire villages, while others saw lighter losses? Why did so many young adults die, when normal flus usually took out the very young and very old? Doctors scribbled notes in frustration, unable to explain the patterns. Theories piled up, but the certainty was just one thing. The flu killed indiscriminately, and no place was really safe. And yet, people still tried to find meaning in the numbers. Governments compared casualty charts like sports standings, as if scoring lower was a victory. Scientists began hunting for the source, though nobody could agree whether it was Kansas, France, or China. The arguments were less about science and more about avoiding blame. In hindsight, the counting wasn't just about death, it was about proof. Proof that the pandemic had been real. Proof that policies mattered. Proof that the world had faced something bigger than any war. But the numbers were so big that they almost lost meaning. Ask a family who buried 3 relatives if the global death toll mattered, and they'd probably say the math was irrelevant. Personal loss always outweighed statistics. Still, those numbers became the benchmark: 50 to 100 million dead. Every pandemic since has been measured against it. Every flu season, every outbreak, every warning includes the same shadow comparison. At least it's not 1918. That grim scoreboard has hung over public health for more than a century. The Spanish flu proved that invisible enemies could outmatch bombs and bullets. But it also showed that humanity's biggest challenge wasn't just the virus, it was keeping count of what it took from us. After the flu ended, the mystery it left behind kept haunting scientists. People wanted answers. What made this virus so deadly? And why did it target young adults instead of children and the elderly? For decades, doctors guessed, argued, and published theories that aged about as well as milk left in the sun. Fast forward to the late 20th century, and science finally got bold. Researchers decided to dig, literally. They exhumed victims buried in permafrost, hoping the frozen ground had preserved tissue. In Alaska, they opened graves of flu victims who'd been buried in icy soil since 1918. It worked. Inside lungs frozen for 80 years, fragments of the virus still lingered. One scientist described the moment as finding a loaded time capsule nobody wanted to open. From those samples, researchers reconstructed the genome. What they found was H1N1. Yes, the same type that caused swine flu decades later, but this one carried bird-like genes, suggesting it jumped from animals to humans in a way that made immune systems panic. That explained the devastation, but not the weird age pattern. Enter the concept of immune imprinting. Basically, your body's immune system never forgets its first flu. Older adults in 1918 had likely encountered a similar virus in 1889, so their bodies were ready. Young adults, on the other hand, had no training. Their immune systems overreacted in what doctors now call a cytokine storm, a fancy term for your body goes nuclear on itself. Strong immune systems turned out to be a liability, like giving dynamite to a toddler. Modern technology filled in more gaps. Sequencing the virus revealed proteins that allowed it to latch onto lung cells deep in the respiratory tract, not just the nose and throat. That meant pneumonia developed fast and brutally. Doctors back then thought they were seeing a superflu. What they were actually seeing was a virus built to bypass normal defences. The reconstruction wasn't just an academic exercise. By understanding the 1918 strain, scientists developed models to predict modern pandemics. Lessons from the genome helped during SARS, swine flu, and even COVID-19. One researcher joked that the Spanish flu is the ghost professor in every virology class, silent but always grading our work. Of course, digging up century-old graves came with controversy. Some critics asked, what if we accidentally unleash it again? Scientists reassured the public that the lab conditions were safer than Fort Knox. Still, the image of researchers pipetting a killer virus back to life made people nervous. Headlines wrote themselves, "Zombie flu reconstructed." Hollywood couldn't have scripted it better. Beyond the lab, science also studied the social patterns. Why did quarantines work in some cities and not others? Why did early closures save lives? Why did so many governments ignore doctors until it was too late? Epidemiologists built models comparing Philadelphia, St. Louis, and other cities, proving that faster action meant fewer deaths. That data has been cited every time new outbreaks appear, from Ebola to COVID. The 1918 flu also left a cultural imprint on medicine. Hospitals realized they needed stockpiles of equipment. Governments recognized the importance of honest communication, even if they didn't always practice it. The phrase public health became more than just two boring words. It became a survival strategy. One of the strangest legacies, scientists still argue about where the flu actually started. Kansas, France, China, no consensus exists. It's like history's worst game of tag. Nobody wants to be it. The truth may never be settled, but the fact that we're still debating it a century later shows how big the question looms. The genomic breakthroughs of the late 20th century didn't just explain the past, they became a guidebook for the future. Every new pandemic threat now gets measured against the 1918 strain. Researchers ask, does it spread as fast? Does it trigger immune storms? Could it be as bad? The Spanish flu is still the benchmark, still the monster under the bed of virology. And in a strange way, that's its most lasting presence. The virus is gone, the victims buried, but in every lab studying influenza, the ghost of 1918 still sits in the corner, quietly reminding scientists what happens when the world isn't ready. By the time scientists pieced together what really happened in 1918, the biggest lesson wasn't about germs, it was about people. The virus was brutal, yes, but human behaviour either slowed it down or sped it up. Cities that shut schools, banned crowds, and enforced masks early came out better. Cities that hesitated ended up with funeral processions longer than their parades. One historian summed it up bluntly. Public health is teamwork, and teamwork doesn't work if half the team refuses to play. That was true in 1918, and it still sounds familiar today. Masks, quarantines, and distancing, all those ideas we think of as modern, were tested a century ago. San Francisco literally fined people for walking around barefaced. St. Louis became the poster child for flattening the curve before the phrase even existed. And while people grumbled about cancelled baseball games, those cancellations saved lives. Turns out, missing a season is better than missing your neighbours. Vaccines weren't available in 1918, but the disaster pushed scientists to speed up flu research. Within decades, seasonal flu shots became normal, and they've been saving lives quietly ever since. Today, millions still die from influenza every decade, but without vaccines, antivirals, and modern care, that number would be far higher. Spanish flu basically dragged us into the modern era of medicine by sheer force. It also taught governments the cost of silence. During World War I, officials censored flu reports to avoid hurting morale. That decision backfired spectacularly. Rumours spread faster than facts, panic spiked, and trust eroded. Compare that to Spain, which reported openly and got stuck with the pandemic's name. Honesty was punished, but dishonesty killed far more. The lesson? Bad news doesn't get better if you hide it. Some habits stuck permanently. Hand washing went from optional courtesy to daily ritual. Cities cracked down on spitting, which might explain why sidewalks look less like spittoons today. Hospitals learned to stockpile supplies, and governments started drawing up playbooks for the next one. Even if those playbooks sometimes gather dust, they exist because 1918 forced the issue. The pandemic also reshaped culture. Families who lived through it carried stories for generations. Grandparents told children about weeks spent indoors, about meals left on porches, about funerals without guests. Those memories shaped how later generations reacted to new outbreaks. When COVID-19 arrived, countless families said, "This feels like what my grandparents told me." That's 1918 still echoing a century later. And here's the tricky part. The flu never really left. Descendants of the 1918 strain still circulate as seasonal influenza today. Every winter, millions catch it. Thousands die, and nobody headlines it because it's routine. The monster shrank, but it didn't vanish. If you've had the flu shot, you've already fought a diluted descendant of 1918. Congratulations, you're part of a century-long rematch. The Spanish flu's biggest lesson isn't just about germs, masks, or vaccines, it's about solidarity. Viruses don't care about borders, politics, or pride. The only defense humanity has ever had is cooperation. When people listen to science, adapt their habits, and look out for each other, the curve bends. When they don't, the flu wins. Simple as that. That's why historians say 1918 was a turning point. It showed the world that invisible enemies can be deadlier than wars, but also that small actions, like wearing cloth on your face or skipping a parade, can change the outcome for thousands. Ordinary people mattered as much as generals or presidents. So what's left, 100 years later? A reminder. Spanish flu isn't just a tragic chapter, it's a mirror. Every time a new outbreak hits, we glance back and ask, did we learn anything? Sometimes the answer is yes, sometimes not enough. But the fact that we're still talking about it proves one thing. 1918 didn't fade into history. It lives on in every hospital protocol, every flu shot, every emergency plan. And maybe the funniest, strangest legacy of all, even after 50 to 100 million deaths, one of the world's lasting memories is still people cutting holes in masks so they could smoke. Humanity, at its best and worst, all rolled into one.